go ahead and start recording. So, Lars, great to see you here. Thanks for joining us. I'll give a quick intro, then you can dive in.
Sure.
So, for those who don't know, Professor Lars Chittka is at University of London, and he's a professor of sensory and behavioral ecology, and he spent 30 years studying bee minds and behavior. He put out an amazing book recently called The Mind of a Bee, and I listened to it, and I'm going to buy it on hard copy because I love it so much. And it goes through in great detail that 30 years of research, of his own research and others, looking specifically at how bees are not only intelligent, but very likely do have their own kind of consciousness. And as I'm sure Lars will talk about, we cannot prove that. Like Lars can't prove that I'm conscious, or I can't prove that Lars is conscious, but we can certainly reasonably infer it based on the data. And so I'm interested to hear Lars talk, partly because it's inherently fascinating, but also because it really, I think, is a good example of how we can use our measurable correlates of consciousness, or the MCC framework, to look at all the relevant data, both neuroscientific, behavioral, and other, to make a reasonable determination about the presence of consciousness in other beings. So with all that said, Lars, go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much for your very kind introduction and the invitation. The host disabled participant screen sharing.
Enable co-host here. That's going to happen.
I guess you need to click some buttons there.
There you go. You're now co-host.
And I just wanted to apologize in advance. We may need to leave early, but I wanted to at least catch some of your talk.
All right. Okay, just checking. Can you all see my cover slide?
Looks great.
All right, great. So just a brief introduction about my own history on this topic of consciousness, because I actually, for many years, while researching bee intelligence and their sensory system and so on, thought that the question of a mind in bees would be basically unanswerable. And then about 10 years ago or so, I started to be invited to all these philosophers' conferences, and they thought I had something interesting to say about consciousness. And I was initially very like, okay, if you guys think so, here's my stuff, but make of that what you will. But I'm not yet fully reassured that we can meaningfully talk about minds and consciousness in the context of insects, or that this question is open to scientific investigation. But sort of over time, they twisted my arm a little bit, so that I've now got presumptuous enough to write a whole book about the topic. So what I'll talk about today is things that I think are broadly relevant to the question of minds or consciousness in animals, and each of them on their own might not be a formal proof of consciousness, but I think it's at least relevant. And I guess as you add more and more pieces of a puzzle, more and more bits of evidence that point in the same direction, the more likely, at least, it becomes that an entity or an animal has something like a conscious awareness. So what I'll talk about today is the question of whether specifically bees have representations of things, of space, and of things in space. I want to ask if there are predictions, some sort of an appreciation of the outcomes of their own actions in the case of bees. In contrast, let's say, to an animal that's permanently stuck in the present and just responding passively to incoming stimuli with hardwired responses. And I want to ask if there is evidence that there are emotion-like states attached to certain spatial settings and so on. What I'll not talk about are topics that have been discussed in the context of bees, but there's not space or time for it today, such as metacognition, attention, representations of time and number, and so on. Let me quickly grab my phone so I can keep an eye on time here. If I knew where it is. All right. So I guess I think there is a general acknowledgement that social insects can do amazing things, but that they do so by means wholly different from how humans do them. So here are two structures that are remotely similar. I've nicked this photo and discussion to some extent from Daniel Dennett's presentations, although I think I have a slightly different view on them. So there's a termite hill and a famous cathedral, La Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, and size differences aside, they look remotely similar in their exterior structure. But the thinking goes that the pathways by which humans on the one hand and insects on the other arrive at these structures are entirely different. That is, that in the human realm, there is an architect who dreams up the structure and draws up a plan, and then passes down instructions to a hierarchy of builders and engineers and so on. Whereas, so the thinking goes, in the insect world, there's no architect, there is no plan of any kind. Everything arises by simple behavior patterns that are innate in the individual, and complexity arises as a kind of byproduct of lots of individuals generating hardwired behaviors. And this strict dichotomy is what I want to explore a little bit today. So the debate is actually quite old. People have wondered for centuries whether something as magnificent as the honeycomb in honeybees, shown on the bottom left here, comes about by self-organization or by some form of insight or planning. And Charles Bonnet, a Swiss naturalist, suggested the following: place together in the same room 10,000 automatons animated with a living force, and induced through the perfect resemblance of their outer and inner being. If we admit the least degree of feeling in these automatons, even only such as is necessary for them to be conscious of their own existence, seek their own conservation, avoid noxious things, prepare useful things, etc., their work will not only be regular, well-proportioned, similar, equal, but it will also have symmetry, strength, convenience to the highest point of perfection. So the remarkable and perhaps slightly confusing thing here is that Bonnet refers to bees on the one hand as automatons, but on the other seems to assume that that their consciousness is almost a given, that they have feelings and so on, and that as a result of them being conscious and having feelings and wanting to prepare useful things, that somehow by self-organization, something as magnificent as the honeycomb might arise. And just to highlight that briefly, because I think we might often forget that it is a marvel of animal architecture. It's highly regular in its structure, symmetrical, as Bonnet says. It's also double-sided, so it's a lot of storage capacity for as little material as possible. And it turns out it's actually close to mathematically optimal in terms of minimizing material while maximizing storage capacity and stability and so on.
I'm curious, Lars, there you say close to mathematical perfection. What would be actually more efficient with space and materials?
Oh, I think I mean, if you go through the mathematics in detail, you find that they're about 0.5% off mathematical optimality with the exact shapes. So I think there are some angles between surfaces at the bottom where they interface between two cells from two sides that you could slightly improve, but given sort of the rigors of evolutionary biology and the noise levels in it, I think this is as close to optimal as anything, to mathematical optimality as anything could get.
Got it, thank you.
Now, François Huber, another Swiss naturalist, was the first to explore the inner workings of the hive by inserting glass screens into beehives to see what might actually be going on inside. And so the normal construction process starts at the top, and bees gradually work their way down along gravity to elongate this two-dimensional construction of honeycomb. You can see several sort of tongue-shaped structures as work in progress. And as bees go on, this would reach the bottom eventually. And the first thing that Hubert and his team 200 years ago, by the way, found was that the bees, when he inserted a glass ceiling to the hive, was that the bees didn't like very much to attach their comb to a slippery surface. And so what they did instead is they started the whole construction at the bottom and gradually built the construction upwards like a tower. And you might say, well, that's pretty, it's still a repetitive process. It still looks robotic in its repetitiveness. But the point there is, had you built a machine, had Colin built a robot, for example, to mimic what happens in nature, that is, the construction starts at the top and goes gradually downwards in an alignment to gravity, that robot would already fall on its nose with the simple task where you can't attach the construction to the ceiling. So it would be easy to add an additional instruction to your machine or algorithm or robot to invert the whole process in its alignment to gravity if that need should arise. But the point is, you'd have to build that in. You'd have to build that instruction. But bees haven't been given it, right? They've never faced this challenge in their evolutionary history before. Now,
Lars, is it okay if we interrupt?
So I guess it depends on whether the questions are necessary to understand the immediate experiment or not, because in my experience, otherwise the discussion we'll never get past slide 4 if we're too freewheeling in our discussion. So ideally, general questions to the end. If I've failed to explain something, then by all means interrupt and say, hang on a minute, Lars, could you a bit more? So is that
It is actually that. And are you saying that they never do this in nature, that there's no examples of them building from the bottom up in nature? Because that would then imply that maybe they just do have that as an extra instruction in their code.
They normally do not, and because they never face slippery surfaces on the top in a natural setting.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So the next challenge, the team were very good at making it more and more difficult, then was that Hubert and team said, all right, so let's now put in a glass ceiling and a glass floor. And in that case, what the bees did was they started their comb on one of the side walls and extended it laterally through the cavity. So, okay, you need yet another instruction for your machine there to replicate the process. But the most remarkable thing was when Hubert and his team, after the bees had begun their two-dimensional construction laterally through the cavity, the team introduced a glass sheet on the opposite wall, the target wall, which the bees would have hit had they continued their construction along the same direction in which they had started building. And the astonishing thing was that the bees, rather than just continuing to build until they'd reached a suboptimal result, amended their construction before that result was reached. So they twisted the entire construction 90 degrees and attached their comb to the nearest wood wall. And this again is before they actually reached, days before they would have reached that suboptimal outcome. And Hubert at the time, 200 years ago or more, exclaimed that I acknowledge that I could not suppress a sentiment of admiration for an action in which the brightest foresight was displayed. Now, these experiments await replication. They're 200 years old, and they were not, I guess, done as systematically as one might do this today, although there were multiple repetitions, but there's no indication of sample sizes and so on. But they are highly visionary, in my view, in probing animals' behavioral flexibility, and indeed, in this case, the question of whether there's some form of a planning ability. Now, the way we now study bees, most bees learning and memory mostly is outside the hive, and in some way referring to their interactions and their learning ability at flowers. And So it's important here to remind ourselves what a bee's daily challenges are. So first of all, they're central place foragers. That is, they have a home to which they must return. And that means that they have to have a very precise spatial memory to make sure that they don't fail in this task. Their excursions can take them, in the case of honeybees, over 10 kilometers away from the native hive, and they have to somehow find their way back without fail, because if they don't, they die, they can't live on their own. I should also say that, unbeknownst to many people, I guess the vast majority of bee species are solitary. They're single mothers where only one individual builds a nest. And in such a case, if that single mother fails to find her home after a foraging flight to flowers, that means her fitness is reset to 0. It means all her offspring die. So there's a very strong selection pressure for precise spatial memory. In addition, they have to be careful shoppers in the flower supermarket. That is, in any bee's flight range, there might be several dozen different plant species, all of which might differ in their nectar and pollen offerings, the costs to harvest these goods, so that they have to manipulate and learn to manipulate flowers, which are often veritable Skinner boxes. They have to learn where the flowers are. And of course, for those flowers that offer the best cost-benefit ratio, they then need to memorize the colors, the scents, the patterns, and so on, to make sure they recognize the best flowers and then concentrate their foraging efforts on just these flowers. And we basically capitalize on this in our experiment, on this natural learning ability, as you can see on the left. So in this slightly tongue-in-cheek experiment, we asked if bees can learn to recognize human faces. And you can see a honeybee about to land on a little platform where there's a sugar water droplet. And after she's done that a few times, we then present her with, well, sort of an analog of a crime witness test, where we have a number of different faces that are also spatially shuffled. And in this case, there's no reward present. And in that case, the bees can indeed find the correct face with about 80% accuracy. So they're quite good at that. But there's no evidence that the bees actually recognize this as a face. It's just, it illustrates bees' flexibility with associating almost any visual stimulus with a reward. To talk a bit more about the spatial challenges, and to just highlight that they're really not trivial. So many of you might have navigated a foreign city. This is Shanghai, where you couldn't read the signs and you couldn't talk to people for directions, and maybe your mobile phone was out of battery, so you had to find your way by memory. And it's not a trivial task, even for human tourists in new environments, but it's actually facilitated by the fact that cities, urban environments, contain lots of buildings that are built to be memorable, to stand out, and to be not easily confused with other buildings. They're meant to be unique looking. So let's say if you're in Paris, then you can see the Eiffel Tower from anywhere, and you can use it as a navigational aid from anywhere. Now, this is the kind of landscape we have around here in central Mexico. This is near Popocatépetl, and this is a typical animal navigation environment. And so I've deliberately chosen a foggy picture because that's often a bee's world as well. And a bee's nest, for example, might be under this tree in the middle, and only under that tree, not the thousands of others, tens of thousands that might look similar anywhere in this environment. And the bee needs to reliably find from this home base a good nectar source, which might be on the right there behind that hill. And alternatively, a good pollen source might be here, and so on. So I don't know if any of you do wild hiking without any technology. There are no paths in this environment whatsoever. I can tell you, it's easy to get lost. And all the more so, I guess, if you have a brain the size of a pinhead. So this is how we study bee navigation. using a technology called harmonic radar, where one dish emits a signal, which is then picked up and bounced back at a different frequency by a transponder attached to a bee's back. And that return signal is then picked up by the top dish, and we can use that to reconstruct the bee's position in space. We've also recently experimented with expanding this to a three-dimensional radar, which, when it works, will not just allow us to see where the bee is in three-dimensional space. So here's a simulation of a honeybee drone flying on an orientation flight, flying through its environment. These two boomerang-shaped things are the bee's eyes, and you can actually see through these simulated eyes how the bee sees it while she's flying. So the knowledge of the three-dimensional position allows us to take the view from the bee's cockpit and see which kinds of landmarks she's actually seeking out to attach her navigation to.
A clarification there, Lars. Really interesting stuff. Pretty amazing you can do this. I'm assuming, since you didn't mention it, you're not using any tracking devices. You're somehow actually locking onto the individual bee.
Yeah, so the bee is carrying a what we call a transponder. So this is not a battery-driven transmitter, but it's called a transponder because it picks up the incoming frequency, transposes it to a different one, and then bounces back this harmonic. That's why it's called harmonic radar.
Oh, I see it now in the picture. So that little the pointy needle is the transponder.
Yep,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So these are the kinds of challenges that we build for our bees. So bees, like humans, often face something called a traveling salesman problem, where, as I guess the problem's name suggests, is a challenge frequently faced by traveling salesmen when, let's say, you need to visit all the stores of a chain in a number of cities, and obviously you want to do that while traveling, minimizing traveling distance and fuel expenditure, and so on. And so here's a simple version of that problem. There are 5 patches of flowers, and or 5 feeding stations, in this case, artificial feeding stations, and a hive down here. And the problem, of course, is even more challenging for bees than for humans, because bees can't, at the start of the day, look at a printout map and have a look where all the cities are, where she wants to go. She has to find the locations in the first place. And the track you see on the left is not obviously yet a very efficient track, but the bee is still exploring. But you can monitor by tracking the bee over all of its attempts to locate the stations and find the optimal array over multiple dozen bouts. And that's shown here in the video on the right. So this is the bee's first flight. We have a counter of its number of flights out from the hive. And now we're in the second bout, and she's found 4 feeding stations. Now she's found the 5th one. But you can see there's still a great deal of exploration outside the area until she increasingly streamlines the route, stops exploring for other stations outside, and then ultimately basically builds the optimum route between these 5 feeding stations, and then also doesn't actually explore anything outside this area. But we're also interested in exploring what the bee does when she's left entirely to her own devices. So we're now not setting her any challenges other than asking the bee to organize her own life and tracking a bee for its entire life. And what I'm about to show you is a bumblebee's maiden flight, the first time she ever leaves the hive. So this is the first time she ever explores her environment. This is sped up over 120 times. And you can see that the bee flies in various directions, always loops back to the vicinity of her home base, and then flies out in a different direction, performs another loop without ever entering her native home, and then flies out again in different directions to explore as much of her environment as possible during what is actually a flight that takes over 2 hours. And one thing that will become important later is that during this very first exploration flight, she visits a forest edge up here. Just bear that in mind for 3 more minutes. Now, on the second day, the bee makes one more exploratory flight. So in all of these paths here, green is early, orange is in the middle, red is later on. So the bee makes one more exploratory flight in a southwesterly direction, flies back to the hive, and then she's discovered something. And then for several dozen flights over several days, explores just one particular exploits one particular patch and does nothing but flying back and forth like an assembly line worker, just focusing on a single task. Then the bee was stuck at home for a few days. After that, so we're now in foraging bout the flight number 83, she flies to this familiar destination a few more times. And then curiously, during one outbound flight, appears to change her mind and flies to a different patch that she had only ever explored once on the very first exploration flight of her life, up here on this forest edge. Oops, where's my mouse here? And she does so, crucially, without retracing her steps to her native home base. So she appears to fly directly to this other patch without retracing any kind of familiar routes and flies over directly to it. And this, while it's anecdotal, this is just an observation of what one bee does, although no bee in the history of science has ever been followed in such detail, but it's just an observational study. But the crucial thing here is that the bee appears to retrieve from memory, from a distant memory, or what in the bee's case is a distant memory, a destination that she had only visited once before, and flies directly to it without any kind of retracing her steps along familiar routes. And that, of course, is relevant in the context of whether there might be such a thing as a cognitive map in bees and other animals, this kind of novel shortcutting. And the jury is still out on that. We need more data, but this is the kind of data I think that we need. Now, when I talked to colleagues working on primates and corvid birds and so on about bees' astonishing spatial memories and memories for colors and patterns and so on, they would often say, well, but that's obvious that a bee needs to be good at these tasks because that's what a bee does. She's a central place forager that needs to visit flowers. So they have to be good at that, but it's a kind of innate preparedness to learn certain things. And these scientists would say, well, we, on the contrary, we train our parrots and corvid birds and so on to tasks that the animal has never encountered in its evolutionary past to probe their flexibility. And one of my colleagues at the time was working on string pulling tasks in parrots. And I sort of flippantly said, oh, I bet our bees can do that as well. And everyone in the room thought that Lars has gone mad entirely. But Sylvain Alem and some students in my team were at least sufficiently bold to try it. So what we're seeing here are 3 artificial flowers under a plexiglass table. The only way to get to the reward is to pull on the string to get the flower out. And this was the first bee that we had ever trained on this task. And you can see that she's still a little clumsy at it, but she's clearly determined to solve the task in the right kind of way, and in the end pulls out the flower successfully. And you can do this experiment in a social learning setting where you pair, in this case, one experienced bee marked with a red dot and one inexperienced bee which does not have the red dot, and now they're both capitalizing on the efforts of the experienced bee, and the naive individual is just scrounging. And you will see in a moment that once they've finished drinking up the droplet in that flower, they're becoming a bit antsy, and because there's nothing more to find. The red bee then runs over in a moment to the next flower and is going to pull the string there, whereas the naive individual is still faffing about at the other flower and hopes to find some more there, but then she runs over. There's clearly an interest in the experienced individual, and again now scrounges on that individual's efforts. But if you do that a number of times, then the ability spreads through entire colonies. They can even learn it by observing it from a distance through a glass screen. And if you do that
Sorry, question on that. Can you back
go
up?
on.
So you showed the video where the bee just jumped in right away and seemed to know how to pull the string. You mentioned you trained that bee. Is that correct? You trained the bee to do that somehow, or was that the training in progress right there?
Well, the training was in progress for the naive individual, right? So the other one had already been trained. And so the vast majority of individuals have the task either through stepwise training, where we present the flowers first open access, then gradually push it further and further under the glass table until they have no choice but to pull the string, or they have to learn it by observing a skilled individual. There are a very tiny minority of bees. I think there were 2 of about 130 that solved the task spontaneously without any kind of training, but that's a rare exception.
Got it, thanks.
Okay, so once you have a number of bees engaging with this task, you can basically see the skill spread through the network of the bee like a meme in a social media network. So what we've done here is all the individuals of a colony are arranged in a circle. Each individual is 1 dot, and they have these little number tags that allow us to identify them. And the individual at the top, the yellow 31, there is the first individual that mastered the task. Once a line forms between 2 individuals, that means that that these 2 individuals have interacted at the string pulling table in the way that you've just seen. Once the dots turn colored, so you can now see there's a good number of orange dots, that means these target individuals have now also learned the task and can do it by themselves. And you can now see at the bottom here, there's 1 purple individual near this is the counter of the pairwise interactions. There's another purple individual. These individuals have no longer learned the task from the originally trained demonstrator, as we call it, but from the second generation of learners, the ones marked in orange. And so for several sequential sets of learners and demonstrators, this skill continues spreading. In fact, in this colony, even beyond the death of the originally trained bee. And bees only live for a few weeks, so it's natural for them to die after a while. But the point there is that it was a culture-like spread of a unique skill that persisted even after the original individuals that mastered the task had died. And what you can see then once you have multiple trained bees is that they indeed seem to almost collaborate or cooperate at pulling the strings out. Certainly they're very attracted to pull on strings where someone else is already pulling. And my postdoc, Olli Lukola, is now, former postdoc, he's now a PI, is now exploring whether they can learn to cooperate. Now, much of this work can still probably be explained with associative learning, but here's a slightly different challenge where we've put the artificial flowers temptingly close to one edge of the table with a relatively short but interrupted string and a much longer continuous string on the other side. And yet this bee spontaneously pulls the continuous string rather than the interrupted string. And this is without further training. So this bee has in the past pulled strings, but she's never faced an interrupted string pulling task before. And what you can see on the left is a different version of that task. So there are now 4 tables with, again, perpendicular, short but interrupted strings and diagonal long strings. And this bee is a bit, she gives up quite easily, but she invariably pulls on the continuous strings, not the short ones. I think, she gives up now again, but then flies finally to the third attempt, and now she pulls out the flower altogether. Now, the list of, this is work in progress, and we need higher sample sizes and a few more controls. But the list of animals that are documented to solve this kind of task spontaneously is very short. It's primates, end of list, including humans. Dolphins, dogs, and so on can be trained to solve such tasks. So after they have experience with interrupted strings, they will then figure out that that's the right thing to do. But these bees here do it spontaneously. So watch this space. This is work in progress, not yet published. Now for the next experiment, I'll let Jane Goodall do the introduction. Let's hope the audio works.
The most recent example which blows people's minds.
Can you hear, Jane?
Is the bumblebee. And the bumblebee has been taught to roll a little ball. He rolls it backwards. He rolls the little ball until he can push it down, or maybe she, I don't know, into a hole, like a goal. And as soon as this little ball gets into the goal, the bumblebee is given a little drop of nectar as a reward. So they learn to do this. But the mind-blowing thing is other bumblebees who've merely watched a taught bumblebee can do the same without being taught, just by watching. And that is supposed to be a mark of very superior intelligence. So this is something we're learning all the time. We have been far too arrogant. The animal kingdom of which we are a part is filled with secrets. And gosh, I'd love to be young and learning about these things now, because all the doors are wide open and you never know what you're going to find.
Yeah, so this was kind of moving for me, because Jane Goodall's work and others like her were sort of part of the reason why I started studying animal behavior in the first place. And for her to notice our work and saying, "Oh, I wish I could be young now and study bees," was pretty amazing. So just to repeat the task here, so as Jane explained, there's a goal area which has a little sugar reward delivered from underneath once the bee has moved the ball to the right target destination. But the social learning task here has a little twist, and that's the following. So you can see 3 balls here at different distances from the goal area. And the point there is that obviously the optimal way to solve the task is to pick the closest ball, the one that's already located the closest to the target area. But we have again here 2 bees, one skilled individual, the so-called demonstrator, is down here. This is a naive observer. And this demonstrator has learned that it actually cannot move the closest 2 balls, this one or this one, to the target, because they're actually glued to the surface. So she knows I can only move this one. And that's what she does. So she moves the furthest ball and moves it to the center. And then both of these bees get a dollop of sugar water. And so this is shown to the naive individual 3 times. You can also, by the way, quite well see the number plates by which we identify our familiar bees. And then we're putting the observer on the spot and asking her, well, okay, are you going to just copy? Are you going to ape what the demonstrator has done and move the furthest ball? Are you just copying the actions? Or can you spontaneously solve the task with the same outcome, but moving a different ball that is the closer one? So in this case, these balls are no longer glued down. And the bee in this case picks the closest ball spontaneously without trial and error. That bee has never rolled balls for reward before. Yet she does the task in a way that is better than what the demonstrator has done, in that she picked a different ball, one that was closer to the target area. So this indicates to us at least some form of appreciation of the desired outcome of the task, rather than just stupid aping of the demonstrator actions to get a reward. Now, a big question, at least for some of us, is how do bees store images or things in object properties in their mind? So we know from decades of work that bees are extremely good at recognizing complex patterns, but it turns out, including from modeling work, neural network modeling, computational neuroscience modeling from people in my own team, that for memorizing flower shapes or complex patterns, you don't actually have to store the images. You can do a lot of pattern recognition with very simple feature detectors, such as edge detectors, some motion detectors that are monitoring changes over time, color detectors, and so on. You don't necessarily need to store a little virtual image in your head to recognize a flower. But one question to get at this question of whether there is a kind of mental representation is to ask whether the memory of a shape is accessible from a different sensory modality. And this is what we've asked here. So we've trained bees, in this case, to recognize balls, but they couldn't actually touch the balls during this training, but only see them through a clear plexiglass lid. And in this case, so this bee has learned to recognize balls, the visual appearance of balls, as rewarding, not cubes. And we can then test the same bees in complete darkness, monitor their behavior with infrared technology, and see which objects they subsequently prefer. And it turns out that the bees trained on balls in a look but don't touch situation spontaneously prefer, once they have the chance to touch them, the balls over the cubes, and vice versa. Of course, we have a balanced design where other bees are trained to cubes over balls. And we can do the reverse as well. So we train the bees in darkness where they can only feel but not see the shapes, and then ask, hey, do you prefer the visual appearance of balls or cubes once they can see, but in this case, not touch them? And so this kind of cross-modal recognition, at least in vertebrates, is taken as evidence for a kind of mental representation of a shape or of an object. It's similar, I guess, in scope to the old-fashioned kiddie birthday party game where you had to reach into, you were blindfolded, you reached into a bag and had to discover, recognize certain objects, say a key or a screwdriver or a spoon, just by touching it without actually looking. And this is just out as of yesterday, since we did all this work with balls. We also explored whether bees actually, in the complete absence of any kind of reward, prefer to interact with them, because as a sort of side observation of the ball rolling learning study, some bees seem to just interact with them outside any kind of training procedure. And indeed, this seems to be the case. So balls are very popular for play object, not just in humans, but in many animal species, I guess, because of the ease with which they can be moved all over the place. And it seems bees are no exception in that regard. But that takes us to the last and perhaps most contentious question. Do bees enjoy things? Do they suffer? Is there a kind of sentience that allows them to have simply emotion-like states, feelings, and so on? And this question, again, has been, at least in theory, explored quite a while ago. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of the amazing Charles Turner. He was an entomologist, an animal behaviorist, and psychologist whose visionary work stood in sharp contrast to the prevailing views at the time by Pavlov and Thorndike and so on, in that Thorndike did not believe that everything in animal cognition was explicable by associations, but thought that instead there is often insight at play and so on. And he was remarkable in many ways, but because he was African-American, he found it at the time impossible to find a position at a major research university, and did much of his work from the position of a high school teacher. And from this background, without any kind of lab or library or person power to help him, technicians or PhD students and so on, he published over 70 articles, of which 3 were in the highly regarded journal Science, and often with very visionary insights. So they've been largely forgotten for all the wrong reasons. But one of the things that he was interested in, although he didn't experimentally explore it, is the question of emotions in insects. So here's a figure from one of his papers where he observes that the coiled antenna, the protruding mouthparts, and the general attitude indicate intense excitement. One who believes that insects have emotions will find much in the attitude of these 2 Ammophilas to support his view. Now, I wouldn't have taken this viewpoint seriously early in my PhD. At a time, it was widely accepted that yes, insects are capable of associative learning, but it stops there. So people thought, and well, you have to imagine that 30 years ago, there were senior neuroscientists saying that cats don't have consciousness, or that it's fine to operate on babies because they're not conscious, they're not suffering, that all their screaming and kicking are just reflexes and so on. That was the prevailing view at the time. So I began to scratch my views a little bit 15 years ago when we did a study on whether bees could learn to avoid predation threats. So there are certain spiders, crab spiders, that lurk on flowers and that can sort of chameleon style adopt the color of the flowers. We took that situation into the lab with what we called our robotic crab spiders, where a bee could be briefly held between 2 soft sponge pads. That's shown here in this video. So just to re-emphasize, this might look gruesome, but they're actually, the bee is completely unharmed. There's no injury. So she lands on a safe flower here. Now she makes a mistake and lands on a spider-infested flower. And then she's released again after a brief interval. So this is mimicking essentially an unsuccessful predation attempt where the bee is quickly captured but escapes. And the question was, can they learn from that? But I don't have a data slide for that. But perhaps unsurprisingly, yes, bees learned to avoid the flowers that had spiders on them, but their whole demeanor changed. So they would scan every flower extensively before landing, even days after such an attack. And the most astonishing thing for me was that they often displayed false alarms. That is, they would inspect a flower and then fly away, even though it was perfectly safe, as if they were seeing ghosts. So this looked to us, well, I'm deliberately anthropomorphizing here, but it looked a bit like a post-traumatic stress disorder where you're fleeing or responding to a threat that actually isn't there at the moment, but just from past memories and past experiences. But this, of course, is not a formal exploration of an emotion-like state, but that's what we tried here. So this is a paradigm borrowed from work on domestic animals. We're essentially asking whether your proverbial glass is half full or half empty. And so the task is one that's often used on goats or dogs or sheep to find out whether your domestic animal is kept in conditions that are appropriate for its emotional well-being or not, as the case may be. And so the glass 50% filled is an ambiguous stimulus that physically is neither here nor there, but an optimist might judge that as being, well, everything's fine, it's still half full, whereas the pessimist might say, oh, it's already half gone. And this is what we did with bees, basically. So we had a little flight arena into which the bee flew, and in it she found either a blue target, let's say on the left, where there's always a reward, or this was a so-called go, no-go task. There was only ever one stimulus present. If there was green without a reward, the bee would, she would over time learn that there's nothing there. And then, of course, we faced it with various ambiguous stimuli. And after some training, the bees would, if she knew blue is always good, fly to that target without hesitation, directly, because she knew, okay, there's a reward. When there was green, she would hesitate a great deal, and sometimes after minutes would finally land going, maybe there's something after all if you're not going to present anything else. The question is, what happens with the ambiguous stimulus? This is now our glass 50% filled. Actually, this is more or less what this glass just has. And we're now asking, hey, do you judge this as more likely being rewarding or unrewarding? And again, measuring the acceptance times that they're taking for this. And the data are shown here on the right. So whatever the conditions, if there's a positive stimulus, that's blue on the left, the latencies are very short, just a few seconds. Whenever there's the negative stimulus, these latencies are way over a minute, close to 2 minutes on average, before they're accepting green on the right. Now, what happens with the ambiguous stimuli? Times are in between, but that's unsurprising. Oops. But the crucial thing is how the bees responded to the ambiguous stimulus depends on what happened to them before they actually entered the setup. If we gave the bees a little surprise reward, just 5 microliters of sugar water before entering the setup, they would respond to all the ambiguous stimuli, that's the red curve here, with a shorter delay than they otherwise would, and that's the black curve. So if they had had that little surprise that they didn't expect before entering the test, they would respond to the ambiguous stimuli with greater readiness in the same way as a happy dog would. And you can do the opposite as well. So Jerry Wright from Oxford University gave bees little surprise predator attacks. And in that case, the emotional bias response is in the opposite direction. So the ambiguous, same physical ambiguous stimulus is now judged with even greater hesitation than bees that had no surprises before they entered the setup. So we're a bit short on time, so I'll skip the coarse grained neuroscience there. So just a few conclusions. I think by at least the definitions that are commonly used in vertebrate animals, that bees have representations of space in some form, that there are representations of things in space, that they can learn by observation, and that there is a form of at least simple tool use in the same manner as token use, perhaps in the human realm, in a manner that indicates some form of intentionality. I also think from our work on spatial memories that there's relatively flexible access to a memory library, an idea of what they want, and that bees somehow mentally explore suitable solutions to get to where they want, using some awareness of the outcomes of their own actions. And finally, at least by the same criteria, we're not lowering the bar here, there seem to be emotion-like states attached to rewards and punishments and so on. And these are, I think, key ingredients of a mind in animals, a very different one with very different priorities compared to our minds, but no less valid for that. And I think that enforces on us some sort of onus to respect these other minds and the environments that shaped them, of course. So thanks very much. Oh yes, you mentioned at the start that I have this new book out, so I'm super excited about that. I've actually got a copy here, it really exists. Yeah, it's my first book, so I'm really happy about that. It was a big challenge, but it's finally out there. Thank you very much. Happy to take any questions.
Yo, thank you so much. I'll ask the first question here, and then I'll let others jump in. So obviously you had only time to go over a pretty small amount of the data you've collected over the years. And one thing you didn't discuss today, which I think is probably pretty, um, let's say, helpful in this debate, is the notion of wound tending. And
Yep.
there's some research, of course, on insects over the decades looking at various kinds of wound tending or the lack thereof, with the idea that in mammals like us, we almost always see very obvious wound tending behavior when an animal is wounded. And this, to us, indicates pain pretty clearly in other mammals. Some research shows that, for example, fruit flies don't do much in the way of wound tending. I'm curious what you have studied or know about the existence of wound tending or similar behavior in bees, and what that tells you about the mind of a bee in terms of its pain and suffering.
Yeah, that's a very good question. That is actually work in progress in our team. I think, yes, as you say, many people have noted an absence of wound tending in some other insects, though I suspect that in many cases they just haven't looked very closely. And of course, it's a convenient approach to take for the many researchers who do fairly gruesome invasive neuroscience without any kind of analgesics and so on. So I think a closer look is important, and that's what one of my PhD students, Matilda Gibbons, is currently doing. She's finalizing her work. So she had a recent paper in PNAS, which was not strictly about wound tending, but is relevant to the question of pain experience. It's a so-called motivational trade-off experience where an animal, instead of rather just displaying a kind of reflex-like response, a nociceptive response where it withdraws from a potentially injurious stimulus, it shows a motivational trade-off with other priorities. And in this case, the bees had a choice between two flower types, one of which was highly rewarding, but was heated to a moderately painful level, and another that was poorly rewarding and was not painful. And in the absence of any painful stimulus, the bee clearly prefer the higher reward option over the low reward option. But if you have a moderately painful stimulus, they can trade off. So on the other hand, if they're equally rewarding and one of them is painful and the other not, then of course they prefer the option without a painful stimulus. But they can trade off the reward and the painful stimulus when the difference in the profitability of the two sources is very high. So they can essentially grit their teeth, if you will, and take the heated high reward stimulus if it's sufficiently more rewarding. And that in other animals, including crustaceans, these kinds of motivational trade-offs have been used as an indicator of pain. So that's already out in PNAS just a few months ago. But she has also done work where she's touched the antenna of a bee with, again, a moderate heat probe. And indeed, bees groom their antenna. And to some extent, there's a kind of generalized grooming after such responses, such stimuli, but there's also specific grooming of the antenna, that the specific one that has been touched with a heat probe. So yes, there is location-specific grooming of body parts that have been experienced a noxious stimulus. But that's work in progress, is not yet published.
Got it. Yeah, there's a lot there. Jonathan, go ahead. You're on mute right now.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really a breathtaking talk. Just the combination of the elegance of your studies and the significance of your findings, and even just the quality of the work. So really, my hat goes off to you for just a fantastic talk. I'd like to mention or explore this issue that you raised about how you had two bees who were able to spontaneously solve the, I guess it was the rope pulling task. And what I'm wondering, sort of two parts of this. One is, does that mean that if you had a hive, even if you didn't train any of the bees, that the hive would figure out this solution, presumably because there'd be at least some that would be able to do it, and then it would be shown to others. And then the second one, which is really sort of the primary thrust of my question, which is individual differences in bees. Were these two bees particularly intelligent bees? If you gave them some other problem to solve, would they be the ones that be the most likely to solve that as well? And to what degree do you see other systematic individual differences among bees? And I don't know, the things we might see in humans, so introversion, extroversion, openness to experience, and so on.
Yeah. So specifically in the context of a string pulling task, we didn't investigate whether bees that were quicker to solve the task or indeed solved it spontaneously were also good at other tasks. But for many other psychological paradigms, we did. And yes, the answer is that individuals are very consistent often in how quickly they learn things. So for example, in tasks where you have to associate either odors, flower odors, or patterns, visual patterns, or colors with 3 words, you can see that individuals that are good at one task are typically also good at another. Even reversal learning. So some people have said that perhaps one trade-off for rapid learning is that you might then form associations too quickly and might have a harder time undoing them, but that's not the case. So bees that are good at learning their first associations are also faster at reversing them. And likewise, we also did studies on neophobia, neophilia, and also there seem to be consistent inter-individual differences. But there are also differences between colonies. So each colony, I guess, has some average and variation around that average. But also if on a colony basis, so for example, while there is variation for learning speed and colors within each colony, if you test this for multiple colonies, you find that there are some that are where on average everyone is pretty fast, and others where on average everyone's pretty slow.
Fantastic, thank you.
All right.
Anyone else? If not, I have some more questions. Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is really, really fascinating stuff. One of the things that comes to mind for me when I think about like insect intelligence and that kind of thing is, you know, getting into the cognitive aspect of it. You repeatedly reference this idea that they can have mental representations. Why, like what is the reasoning for why it has to be a mental representation? Could there be some other way that they're performing this cognition that allows for this kind of behavior, aside from they have some sort of like, because it's the mental representation, as I understand it, it's still just this kind of like theoretical construct that we have because it's convenient to us, but it's not like we can even really find that accurately in humans. Right. And a lot of these behaviors, they have this kind of emergent quality to them that, you know, they're like context specific. And I'm kind of wondering how much you've considered sort of those kind of alternative cognitive ideas to explain this kind of intelligence aside from just like mental representations.
Yeah. I mean, each of these studies individually, of course, has a variety of controls that we used. But without going into the details of all of them, you could clearly state with some justification that each and every one of the experimental performances that I've shown could be done by a machine, right? You could program a machine to build honeycomb structures in all the kinds of different ways that I've shown. You could program a machine to pull strings and respond accurately to interruptions of strings. You could program a machine to recognize a shape in one sensory modality and then in another one. You'd be right in saying that you could, I mean, a robot could do all of these things, but The crucial thing, I think, is that with most of these abilities, you'd have to build every one of these routines into your machine. You couldn't just build one or two of them into your robot and it would then spontaneously solve all the other ones. And that, I guess, is the key difference. So if we had built a mindless machine that can do all of this and demonstrably without mental representations, if that machine had been programmed to do everything we knew about bees 10 years ago, then yes, the machine would have replicated what we knew about learning to handle flowers and some aspects of spatial navigation, but the machine would most likely not have been able to manipulate objects in these kinds of ways as we now know it does. And so I think that each individual of these studies on its own, if that was the sole thread of evidence that we had, would not necessarily be an evidence for any kind of mental operations rather than trial and error and so on. But taking all of them together, I think we're nudging probabilities in the direction that there is some sort of more flexible system at work, one that isn't just an accumulation of a toolbox of solving various predictable problems, but one that can actually solve a problem mentally without physically trying different solutions and so on. But that's a question of probabilities. None of the experiments that I've shown would be accepted, but not more so than by studies on other animals. None of them would be a formal proof of a mental operation.
Right. Well, I mean, I agree with you, and I buy into the idea that these creatures are not machine-like, and that there's definitely this kind of you could call it consciousness, you could call it intentionality, you could call it even some kind of reasoning that's going on. But the part that I guess I'm trying to ask about is, you know, if you accept that like the bee is like this, and it's not simply machine-like, does it have to be this kind of cognitive mental representation model that can elicit that type of intelligence, or are there other more flexible, more emergent kind of models that could still work? And that's not to say that it's like a machine, it's just trying to understand, because like the bee is so much different from us, it's so much different from mammals and the way that we are. And you know, one of the directions that my mind goes in is just like this type of intelligence that they have, it's going to be radically different from what we're used to, and we might be making some kind of category error when we try to apply the things that work for human intelligence onto insect intelligence. Do you understand what I'm kind of trying to?
Yeah, I mean, that's undoubtedly true. And to the extent that the inner world of bees is accessible to us, that's certainly the case. And where it's accessible to us, of course, to some extent at least, is its sensory world. And in its sensory world, pretty much everything is entirely different. So if you look at their vision, they see ultraviolet light, which we do not. On the other hand, their spectrum does not extend as far into long wavelength as ours does. They see polarized light, which we cannot. They appear to have a magnetic compass, although the way in which that is mechanistically implemented is still unknown. They're practically deaf, so their hearing isn't particularly good, but a lot of what we hear of bee sounds coming from inside a hive is actually picked up by mechanosensors, by vibrations on the comb. So there's a very rich world of vibrations that they orient and communicate in, and of course of pheromones, of chemicals that surround them and by which they signal to each other. So they're at the input level, their sensory world is already entirely different. And so presumably is everything based on that sensory world. So nothing that's in the mind. I mean, everything has gone through the senses in some way. So the contents of their memory and so on must also be very different. And yes, I mean, many of the the brain structures that mediate certain activities have almost have certainly come about by convergent evolution. But many of the key building blocks, channel molecules, transmitters, and so on, are common to both. Some of the computational principles are similar. So you find in the bees' mushroom bodies so these are structures that mediate multisensory integration and learning and memory. You find a kind of fan-in, fan-out architecture, fan-out, fan-in, which tremendously increases storage space as well as specificity. And you find that convergently in cephalopods as well as in invertebrates as well. So there are some similarities in the computational principles, presumably, but often arrived at by convergent evolution.
Jonathan, go ahead. You're on mute.
Yeah, I wonder, following up on my last question, if you could speak to what might be characterized as culture within hive. You were mentioning that some hives, you know, as a group were faster at learning some things than others, capacity for culture. But it sounds like these kinds of variations and capacity for learning and modeling should lead to some significant evidence of cultural differences between hives.
Yeah, it's at least plausible from what we now know about bees' ability to innovate new things and to copy from each other, and then to retain these skills over multiple sequential sets or generations of workers, even though in our experiments these weren't formal biological generations in a sense of there being a parental generation and their offspring. They were just sequential sets of learners. And yes, so the let's say with this string pulling task, the only colony of bees that at any one time did this in the world were the ones in our lab, and all other colonies did not. So in the wild, if you had some sort of comparable skill, then yes, that would be specific to those colonies that have invented, then copy it, and then retained it over time. We don't have any natural observations of culture-like phenomena in wild bees, but that's perhaps because we haven't looked yet closely enough. So one potential challenge for this to be a relevant natural phenomenon in temperate habitats, at least, is that bumblebee colonies, for example, collapse at the end of the year and they restart again from a single overwintered queen in the next year. But in the tropics, many bee colonies and bee species persist for many years, sometimes decades. And especially in tropical stingless bees, there is, for example, huge variation in nest architecture, where some build horizontal combs, some build spiral-shaped combs, some vertical ones, but also with subtle variation between colonies of the same species in some cases. And because these colonies persist for so many years, at least it's plausible that these are not just genetic differences, but possibly also learned differences. So we don't know the relevance of this phenomenon in nature, but it's at least from what we know now about the bees' social learning skills, it's not implausible.
Fantastic answer. I just want to, is there more variation in the structures of hives in the more tropical context relative to the temperate ones? And wouldn't that itself be an argument for culture?
It's an argument of plausibility, but not, I guess, yet an experimental demonstration. So one would have to look very closely at the heritability of such patterns, the way in which these architectures are passed on from mother colonies to daughter colonies and so on. But at least it's plausible, yes.
Thank you.
Let me follow up on that real quick, and then I'll go to Desmond. In terms of culture, the waggle dance, of course, is a big part of bee behavior that's been, offered as an example of bee intelligence, possible consciousness. You discussed in your book, you didn't talk about it today, but are there dialects in waggle dance? And would that itself be an indication of culture?
Yes, to some extent. To the first question, we don't know. To the second question, so there appears to be certainly variation between related species in dance dialects. So I should explain perhaps, or does everyone know about the bee dance language? Yeah, okay. So there are some subtle variations on how they code distance and direction in their indications to hive mates between species, and also between populations of the same species, for what we know. Now, some of this work dates back to the 1950s, Martin Lindauer and colleagues. It's more recently been shown that bees' estimation of distance is not objective, of course, but is to some extent driven by their experience of the structure of the landscape over which they fly. So that if there is a high amount of contrast, they think that they have flown further than in poor contrasting landscapes. So it is possible that some of these historic works of between population differences in the dance language are actually not driven by either culture or genetic background, but by the actual environment experienced while the bees were flying to a destination and back. So again, if to test this formally, I mean, some such variation is tempting to assume that it's cultural in its origins, but we need formal experimental tests of that.
Thank you. Desmond, go ahead. You're on mute.
Hi, how you doing? Loving your work. This is absolutely fascinating, and I will never look at bees ever the same again. So I guess this is also a little bit in crossover to what Tam Hunt does, but I'm kind of wondering, when you're observing the consciousness of the bees, where are your boundaries? Because you said that one bee individual will not survive without its colony. So if we're looking at the consciousness of of this organism, are we putting the boundaries within the whole colony, or are we breaking down this consciousness down to single entities within the colony? And so it has to do with some of this stuff that Tam was talking about with some of the heuristics and I guess measuring just the general consciousness of the colony.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So some people like Tom Seeley, another bee biologist, propose that there is actually something like a hive mind, that there is a level of a mind above the individual. And I'm not sure I'm fully sold that there is evidence for that. So colonies of bees as a whole undoubtedly are can solve problems that no individual ever could in very impressive ways. But largely the interactions of the bees in these colony level processes, for what we know, seem largely innate. And so as complex as these problem solving strategies might be, I don't think there are any more mental necessarily than, let's say, our immune system, which is also impressive in its complexity. It indeed has a form of memory, but I don't think it has a kind of collective mind, our immune system, any more or less than the bee swarm. So bees undoubtedly can do very impressive things collectively, like humans. I mean, we can do all kinds of things, from Mexican waves in a football stadium that require sort of intense coordination in some way with our neighbors, and from there to building cities and organizing education systems and so on. But there's still, in all of these collective efforts, I think, as many individual minds as there are individuals in that group. There's not, I think, any evidence of a swarm having a feeling, an emotion-like state. But if you find that, let's say, a group of insects becomes particularly aggressive, then that's each individual, not sort of some sort of swarm level of a mind or of any kind of emotional processes. But
Thank you for
this
elaborating.
is a controversial question. I'm happy to be convinced otherwise.
Colin, go ahead.
Hi, I was wondering if there's been any attempt to see how the language capabilities can be extended beyond the waggle dance by any species of bee. It would be really amazing if we could get them to create an extension to their little waggle language, or some other way of signaling symbolic representations of some kind of other context and pass it on. I don't know if anyone's ever tried to do that. I'm interested to know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that the bee dance language, even though it's called a language, is probably fundamentally different from human language in that the vocabulary in the bee dance language is very limited and hardwired. So it has words for direction and distance, but it doesn't have words for toxic insecticides or any other novel things that in the human language, of course, it's easy to invent a new label for anything novel that we come across, and to exchange these labels randomly and so on. And no animal language, to my knowledge, has that kind of flexibility. Now, I mean, our bees are surprisingly good at learning things from observing what other bees do, even across species boundaries. So on the receiving end, I think there's quite a bit of flexibility, but to my mind, to my knowledge, there's no evidence that in contexts other than the dance language, there are attempts to actively pass on information to other individuals, and much less with new symbols, for example. So there are limits, obviously, to bees' intelligence if you compare them with other animals, including humans.
Thank you. We're at time, but I'm going to just ask one last question. If you can answer it succinctly, I'd appreciate it. Let me ask a meta question. I come at this work as already convinced that mind is generally pervasive in nature, and it complexifies as matter complexifies. This is known as panpsychism. I came to this view philosophically and logically over the years, being a biologist by training. I see how biology and form evolves in an incremental stepwise fashion. It would make sense, therefore, that mind would evolve in a stepwise incremental fashion with form. Others don't share my predispositions, my own biases. I have no problem accepting that bees are highly intelligent and conscious. Others may come at it very differently and may be very skeptical and say, well, you need to show me that bee is conscious. And what you show me so far, I can explain it through automated behavior. Yes, it's intelligent in some way, but a lot of things in nature are intelligent but not conscious. I'm curious of your response from your colleagues and other people reading your work over the years. Have you reflected much on the role of those innate biases and how they affect the Bayesian priors we all bring to these questions of the nature of consciousness?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's I've of course talked to people who believe that, let's say, plants are conscious, or indeed light switches and so on. And I am not necessarily ideologically adverse to the notion of expanding consciousness to all kinds of organisms or things that are not traditionally thought to be conscious, but I think we have to steer clear of any ideology or dogma in that question, and we need, I think, to consider the evidence for the various entities that we're looking at. We need criteria, I think, to diagnose whether a biological entity or an artificial intelligence system is or isn't conscious, and that's not an easy task, obviously, because there isn't a single universally accepted criterion for consciousness. So we all have to argue with a bit of common sense and collect evidence, I guess, from multiple different directions to build a case either one way or another. And that can come from psychological work, from neurobiological work, from Bayesian priors, as you say, and so on. So I think the more building blocks of evidence for any one organism we can accumulate, the more the probability becomes higher that that organism or entity is conscious. But I'm probably hesitant to extend it automatically to, say, all biological systems.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Really amazing talk, and really appreciate your time.
All right. Well, thank you very much for
that was
listening.
fantastic.
It's been a great discussion also.
Really.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, I'll post a recording shortly and send you a link, okay?
All right.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right then.
Thank you.